Hey everybody, some Gadget Guy here, and we are taking a look at Samsung's new Galaxy Alpha. Before we jump fully into this review, I do need to drop just that little bit of a disclaimer where Samsung is trying to start a new conversation with the Galaxy Alpha. If you're someone who really prides themselves on having smartphones with bleeding edge specs, that you're a hardcore power user, Samsung is not really targeting that element of the Android ecosystem or the smartphone ecosystem with the Galaxy Alpha. Well, we can point to Samsung as one of the companies most responsible for initiating the specs first commentary on Android, and their software approach with TouchWiz has been an everything in the kitchen sink style of hardware development. But with the Galaxy Alpha, they are trying to start a new conversation on refining the experience and simplifying the smartphone experience while still providing us with many power user features. I'm not a big fan of reading through all the specs. I figure you guys can look that stuff up on your own. Now, 4.7-inch display is my sweet spot, and I still think that the screen on the HTC M7 from last year is still one of the best all-rounder compromises between having a screen large enough to do work on, but then also small enough for us to be able to use ergonomically and easily. Of course, now most of our phones feature 5-inch displays, and here is the Galaxy Alpha next to a Nokia Lumia icon. The Galaxy Alpha next to last year's LG G2. This was a champion of cramming a larger screen into a smaller form factor. Here's the Galaxy Alpha next to its bigger brother, the Galaxy S5. The Galaxy Alpha is targeting more of a fashion phone market, but of course HTC's been here for a couple generations designing stylish devices. So here is the HTC One M8 next to the Galaxy Alpha. I actually had to zoom the video out there a little bit. But here is the Galaxy Alpha next to the LG G Flex with a 6-inch display. So right off the bat, I just kind of need to thank Samsung for coming back to a smaller screen size, a smaller form factor device. As folks like me who really like premium, high-end smartphones haven't really had any options below 5 inches for a couple years now. For a premier smartphone, the Galaxy Alpha is only going to stand with the Sony Z3 Compact and the iPhone 6 for offering us easy one-thumb navigation in a smartphone which isn't crippled, gimped, or mid-range. I don't know of any AMOLED panels. Someone correct me down in the comments if I've missed one. I don't know of any AMOLED panels that have 1080p resolutions under 5 inches. So 720p resolution is maybe a bummer coming off of a phone like the HTC M7, but I am a fan of AMOLED displays, and I love this contrast ratio where blacks are pure black, and you have a hard time detecting where the edge of the bezel is, where the edge of the screen is. Plus, you just get that insane candy color saturation, which I love. It's sort of eye-searingly colorful and bright. And with the display being very nicely well saturated, it's also surprisingly bright. I don't know that it's quite as bright as a Galaxy S5, but it gets us very close to the kind of outdoor viewability that I've just become accustomed to on Galaxy smartphones and also on Nokia Lumia devices. We've got a decently loud earpiece here at the top. I don't know that Samsung phones have ever won awards for having the loudest earpiece speakers, but this one seems to get the job done even in challenging outdoor situations. We of course have the fingerprint scanner down at the bottom, which for me has almost exactly the same problems that the fingerprint scanner has on the Galaxy S5. See where I hold the phone and I kind of brace it into the pad of my hand there? Where is the fingerprint scanner? Oh, well, it's down here at the bottom, which means I need to move the phone to reach the bottom fingerprint scanner. And it also comes with an action. I can't just hold my thumb on the home button, which would be easy and natural, very much like what Apple has given us on Touch ID. No, I've got to make it more of a swipe, which means if I train any of my fingers to use one-handed, it's going to be the thumb, and I've got to train it at a weird sort of sideways action here. It works okay. It doesn't work consistently enough for me to keep using it, and I pretty much always just rely on a pattern unlock on my phones now anyway, just for consistency's sake. Walking around the sides of the phone, we've got the power button on the right-hand side, and I love the metal feel, the metal band running all around. It feels so much higher quality than the silvery plastic that used to come on Samsung devices. On the left-hand side of the phone, we've got the volume rocker, and while it's a one-piece volume rocker, we have these great little edges cut into the volume rocker so you can very, very quickly feel where the volume up and volume down buttons are. The top of the phone, the metal trails over and around the headphone jack in a beautifully detailed way. Whereas other, more attractive phones like the HTC M8, I feel that the headphone jack is often sort of shoved to one side and it looks really unbalanced. Samsung's done a really good job of addressing how that's going to fit together with a nice also plastic edging running along the inside. It's attractive, it's clean, and it also feels really good when you're punching headphones in. Plus, I just like the look on how these antenna cutouts bridge the top and bottom of the phone. And speaking speaking of the bottom of the phone, we've got a nicely finished off micro USB port. Also kind of curious that they went with micro USB 2 instead of the micro USB 3 connector found on the bottom of the Galaxy S5. That really does seem like it might have been a one-off experiment, and Samsung might be sticking with USB 2 moving forward for their future phones. But I have none of the complaints with this USB jack as I've had with phones like the LG G3, which feel really scratchy and unfinished. This has a very nice, smooth, clicky action to it, and it's just really wonderful to use. Plus, it just looks nicer than some of the other ports and jacks that we've had on other various Android and Windows phones. And in a change of pace for Samsung, we now have the speaker on the bottom of the phone. This is a bottom firing speaker as opposed to a rear firing speaker. I still think phones should have speakers on the front of the device, but at least it's not pointing in totally the wrong direction. And if you put your phone in your pocket, it's much more likely that sound will fire up out of your pocket as opposed to into your pocket or into your thigh. And that brings us to the back of the phone, and I am loving the redesign on the back of the Galaxy Alpha. This is still a faux leather soft matte touch plastic, but it's got a nicer feel to it than what we had on the Galaxy S5. Making those dimples smaller hasn't affected the grippability of the Galaxy Alpha, but at least it's walked us away from the Band-Aid look of the Galaxy S5. I think it's a lot more attractive while still retaining the practicality or the functionality. Now, Samsung has been designing their own camera sensors for a couple years now, and this is only the second phone after the Galaxy S5 to use one of their new ISO cell sensors. We've done a full comprehensive real-world test of the camera on the Alpha shooting UHD video. You can really get a sense of what this camera can do. Even though it's a lower resolution, it's a 12 megapixel instead of a 16 megapixel sensor, it does phenomenally well throughout most of our benchmarks and tests. And while Samsung is staying quiet about the sensor size, I would be very surprised if this sensor were smaller than the sensor on the Galaxy S5 by any great degree. Qualities like a shallow depth of field and bokeh blur are much more pleasant on the Alpha camera than I've seen on the LG G3 or the iPhone 6. So while I still find Samsung cameras are a little bit more difficult to use, the app is a little bit more complicated, I think the results that you can get out of the Alpha camera with a little fiddling and a little practice will rival those of the Nokia and Sony Xperia cameras that have really impressed us with their larger sensor sizes. And of course, we also have an LED flash, and the heart rate monitor makes a return from the Galaxy S5 as well. Even though Samsung is talking refinement with the Galaxy Alpha, they are still packing in a ton of hardware features for you to play with. Sadly though, one feature that I have come to love on all of these Android smartphones is the IR blaster, which is now missing on the Galaxy Alpha. You cannot use the Alpha as a universal remote for your TV and stereo, and that is one that I am sorry to see go. Thankfully, we can still pop the back cover off of the phone. Even though there is no memory card slot for the Galaxy Alpha, we at least have a base model Galaxy Alpha with 32 gigabytes of storage on board. In my opinion, this should be the new minimum for any premier or flagship phone. And packed into the back of the Galaxy Alpha is an 1800 milliamp hour battery. Again, and I feel like I'm going to be repeating myself on this point a lot, the Alpha is not targeting power users or hardcore productivity users. So in my usage over a weekend, using this phone for mainly social networking, keeping up with my email, snapping some pics and videos, sharing those pics and videos to social media, and listening to music for around an hour a day, this 1800 milliamp hour cell was more than capable of getting me through the day and usually to dinner before I was needing to recharge the phone. I think that's pretty reasonable usage considering the demographics this phone is targeted at. At its thickest, the Galaxy Alpha is only 6.7 millimeters thick. And you can see it lines up really well with just the plastic silver trim on the Galaxy S5. Galaxy S5 at its thickest is 8.1 millimeters thick. That means that the Galaxy Alpha is coming in a fraction of a millimeter, 2/10 of a millimeter thinner than the iPhone 6. But in making a phone this thin, especially compared to the Galaxy S5's 2800 milliamp hour battery, that is absolutely one area where we are facing, in my opinion, a real compromise. I mean, it's a bummer when you don't get a memory card slot, but they put in 32 gigabytes of storage. It's kind of a bummer that they reduced the megapixels on the camera, but I think it still shoots a much higher quality image, even if it's a slightly lower resolution image than 1/3 inch sensor cameras can. Unfortunately, you just can't get around thin. And while I can make it to dinner and sometimes through dinner into the evening on this smartphone, I really do wish I could hypermile it to the 2-day usage that I can sometimes get out of my S5 and that I regularly get out of my LG G2 and G3. I mean, once you've spent a little time reviewing phablets where they can just physically put in a humongous battery, you just get spoiled with 2-day battery life. And that's maybe the most significant compromise I think owners of the Galaxy Alpha will have to make. Now, the Alpha uses a Samsung-built octa octa-core processor. It's not using a Qualcomm series CPU, which we actually haven't had the opportunity to play with as much here in the United States, as most carriers go with the Qualcomm-built CPU and radio hardware. But this octa-core processor divides tasks between a higher power 1.8 gigahertz Cortex A15 processor and then a lower power 1.3 gigahertz Cortex A7 processor. Honestly, in going about performance, I'd be really hard pressed to notice a substantial difference in performance between this and, say, a Galaxy S5. This has been one of the snappier TouchWiz phones I've used in a little while. It doesn't seem to get overly bogged down when you've got a ton of notifications. You can page through apps really easily. But I don't know whether I would chalk that up to the Samsung processor, this octa-core processor, or if that might be because we're also only dealing with a 720p display, so the phone just isn't having to work as hard to render elements of the UI. But while we've gone through a number of fantastic hardware refinements on the Galaxy Alpha, we're still dealing with TouchWiz as the UI slapped on top of Android. And there are a number of people who really like what TouchWiz brings to the table, but if you weren't a fan of TouchWiz on other phones, you're not going to be a fan of TouchWiz here. Even down to elements like my home screens, I've already disabled the My Magazine. Whenever you swipe all the way to the left, there's this sort of flipboard style magazine thing which pops up and tries to feed you content that you might like. I find it slows down my home screens, and I like my home screens just being a very simple three-piece affair. So of course I got rid of that. And even though it's better and it's faster, I still find myself having issues with the gallery. But while the gallery does things like try and sync your online accounts and your Picasa and Google accounts, performance on this will slow to a crawl. The camera app is very similar to what we've seen on previous Samsungs, especially like the Galaxy S5. And thankfully, the ISO camera sensor shoots natively 16:9. The full 12 megapixel resolution is being used in a widescreen format. And I find this really helpful. I like these 16:9 sensors. It means that I can stay full resolution on my stills, compose the scene, and then decide whether or not I want to shoot video or take a picture. And for those of you who like settings, there are a ton of them in the Samsung camera app. This does not have hardware image stabilization, so you'll probably want to leave the picture stabilization on, and Samsung has refined this app a little bit so it doesn't lag quite as much in low light situations as the Galaxy S5 does. We've got face detection, we've got different metering modes. I love having the ability to change metering. We can change the video resolution from UHD down to 640 by 480 if you want to drop to something really, really low quality with 720p and 1080p in the middle. And we do have different recording modes, slow motion and fast motion. The fast motion really becomes more of like a time-lapse feature or a hyper-lapse feature for those of you who are all hip and trendy with your new camera modes. You can disable the shutter sound, we've got grid lines, and then the all-important exposure values, which I like to keep in the main body of the app. Quickly now, you can come in and toggle a minor adjustment to how bright or how dark you want your scene to play out. So utilizing a tap to take pics setting where you just tap the screen and it'll automatically take a picture after it focuses, you can make this app as complicated or as simple as you'd like to go. And as we turn to our phones for more content creation, the Galaxy Alpha is really whetting my appetite for what we might see with the Galaxy Note 4 and hardware image stabilization on these new ISO-cell sensors. This is only the second phone to have a Samsung-built camera sensor, and I think it's already starting to give Nokia and Sony a run for their money. Just bullet point for bullet point, Samsung really does seem to have one phone in mind as competition for the Galaxy Alpha, and that's the iPhone 6. 4.7-inch display, 4.7-inch display on the iPhone 6. Fingerprint scanner? Sure, the iPhone 6 has a fingerprint scanner. Super thin build and more of a focus on style, design, and aesthetics? Yep, that's definitely the territory where the iPhone has been most successful. And the more I use this phone, the more I really think Samsung did not have the rest of the Android ecosystem in its sights. And getting into those kinds of conversations and really comparing the pricing, where if you shop this phone online through Best Buy or through Amazon, I've got links down below this video so you can check out where you can shop the Galaxy Alpha. Even the price point seems really targeted at people who might be considering an ecosystem switch, either from iOS to Android, or protecting against switching from Android to iOS. And I really do feel that this experiment is largely successful. I love the scooped and beveled edges coming along the sides of the phone. They're nicely rounded and fit really comfortably in the pad of my hand. And those edges are very nicely contoured. So we have these bevels here also, which prevent any sharp edges sort of marring that experience. And you just don't feel like you're constantly about to drop it like you might with an iPhone 6 with its rounded sides and corners. So folks, where does that leave us with the Galaxy Alpha? Has Samsung completely nailed the experiment of focusing on refining the Galaxy experience? Probably not. I absolutely adore what Samsung has done with the hardware on the Galaxy Alpha. I still would like them to take a look at some of their software strategy moving forward, especially in refining TouchWiz. But this is absolutely where I hope to see Samsung move forward with the rest of their device lineup. We know that the Galaxy Note 4 will also resemble this experiment with the aluminum sides and the plastic backplate. And I love seeing the sort of lumped and slightly more reinforced corners return from the Galaxy S5 Active. But I hope to see a Galaxy Alpha 2 alongside a Galaxy S6 next year, and all of those phones retaining this style of build. I've seen a lot of reviews giving the Galaxy Alpha flack over having the lower resolution screen, having the smaller battery, losing the micro SD card slot, and having fewer megapixels on the camera. But honestly, in using this thing day to day, that hasn't impacted my experience of using a smartphone as much as I thought it would. And the core experience of having a smartphone which fits more organically in my hand outweigh some of those criticisms. Like my disclaimer at the top of this video, if you're shopping something like a Note, or you're looking at bleeding edge specs, or you're wanting the most uncompromising, data-driven productivity experience on the market, this phone has not been designed for you. This phone largely has not been designed for most of the flagship Android marketplace, which looks at specs to really determine whether or not a device will be good or bad. But if you're shopping for a premier smartphone, a premium experience, a luxury car feeling smartphone in the Android ecosystem, you really only have the Sony Xperia Z3 Compact and the Galaxy Alpha. Those are the only two phones we can turn to if we want a smaller form factor experience that isn't completely gimped in the mid-range. To that end, for me personally, were I shopping a Samsung right now, I would probably be veering more towards the Galaxy Alpha than the Galaxy S5. And I just think Samsung is so much more exciting when they are targeting a specific market as opposed to building an all-rounder. The Galaxy S5 isn't as much fun for me as the Galaxy S5 Active. If you want the most uncompromising productivity-driven device, you've got the Note. And now, if we want something a little more stylish and a little more refined from the hardware perspective, we have the Galaxy Alpha. But of course, I always want to hear from you fine folks out there watching my videos. Have you been shopping the Alpha? Are you considering a premium or premier smartphone? What do you think really defines the experience of having a flagship? And is this phone enough to keep you from switching over to, say, an iPhone 6? Or if you're using an older generation iPhone, is this the type of phone you want to see more in the Android ecosystem to consider swaying you out of iOS and into the Android ecosystem? Definitely drop me some comments below, because this is the stuff I love getting into discussions about, and I love the comments that you guys drop on my videos. As always, thanks so much for watching my videos, subscribing to my channel, sharing my videos. You guys have been phenomenal in sharing my videos on Twitter and Google Plus and Facebook, and I can't thank you enough because it's so much fun sharing this tech goodness with you fine folks. Hit that thumbs up button, and I will catch you all on the next review.